5th of January 1942, Tokyo celebrates, but an admiral at sea counts the cost. Isoroku Yamamoto watched flags and fireworks from the deck of the Yamato, while his mind moved over maps. Where others saw triumph, he felt a closing clock. He had been to Washington and London. He knew how great powers erode when pride outpaces planning. He warned friends in blunt, private words. Japan would spread like an octopus, but that spread would not last. He believed the window was narrow, perhaps a year and a half, to turn victories into a peace the empire could survive. That quiet judgment put him at odds with the loudest voices in Tokyo. Some generals wanted endless conquest. Yamamoto wanted a single, spectacular stroke to force negotiation. From that tension came orders that would shape many destinies: plans for a carrier trap at Midway, a diversion in the Aleutians, and farther south, moves to secure airfields and bases across the Solomons. For soldiers drafted as pioneers and laborers, for men who packed rice and hammered coral runways, these high commands were abstract until the moment the first bullets fell. The imperial euphoria that sent ships and planes outward also sent boys and tired veterans into raw jungle heat to build what they could not fully defend. This introduction asks you to stand with the other side, to see Tokyo's jubilation and Yamamoto's private warning, but also to feel the smallness of those sent to die on tiny islands. It is a story of decisions in rooms lit by maps, and of men who read only the orders, who left breakfasts unfinished, who dug foxholes where commanders had drawn lines. We will follow how a careful admiral's dread, political bluster, and a string of hurried plans converged into a single night in the Solomons. Watch the next chapter to see how strategy turned into survival, and how the losers of great plans paid the highest price. They cheered in Tokyo. From the deck of the Yamato, Isoroku Yamamoto timed the small private clock of his fear. 5th January 1942. On shore, the streets were a furnace of celebration. Flags, lanterns, and the easy loudness of people who believed that history had turned in their favor. At sea, the maps on Yamamoto's table did not glow. They lay flat and cold, marked with thin black lines and the small, terrible symbols of ships and airfields. He had not come to the flagship to bask. He had come because friends warned that if he stayed in Tokyo, his voice, the one that urged caution, might be silenced for good. Better to have arguments with paper and charts than with assassins in the dark. The victory to most was simple. Pearl Harbor had crippled the battleship fleet. British capital ships were sunk off Malaya. The Philippines and Hong Kong had fallen. Cavite was lost. Triumph fed headlines and swagger. Yet Yamamoto read the situation reports and thought like a man who had once walked the corridors of Washington and London, a diplomat who knew the patience of empires and the slow arithmetic by which power ebbs. He had seen how brittle success can be when it is measured by pride instead of by planning. Around him, the naval staff argued in a rising key. The hawks wanted to press. The nation had momentum. Why stop? They imagined tentacles stretching outward indefinitely. Yamamoto heard the word invincible more than once, and it made his jaw tighten. He told his chief of staff, Motome Ugaki, to have plans ready by mid-February. Speed, yes, but speed with a map that led to a possible settlement, not to ruin. Far-sighted statesmanship, he told them, a phrase Ugaki later wrote into his diary, as if to pin a moral to a weathered sleeve. Here is the first sorrow of the losing side. Decisions made in painted rooms, and the lives signed away in ink by men who will never see the mud and the jammed airfields they authorize. Yamamoto's caution did not come from cowardice. It came from an interior ledger, memories of diplomatic negotiations, of the London naval conferences, of staying in American hotels and hearing the quiet confidence of a country with endless resources. He understood privately and bitterly that triumph could be a slow suicide if it made enemies larger than the gains were worth. He spoke in private to an old friend, Ryoichi Sasakawa. He used the octopus image. At first, the empire would spread its tentacles, and the world would seem captured. Then the animal would lay flat, vulnerable. He set a calendar, 18 months of advantage at most, to force a peace that could be lived with. He looked to men like Sasakawa, not only to execute plans but to whisper terms where politics had failed. This was not merely strategy. It was a concession to time and to the human limits of any state. But not everyone shared the sense of a ticking clock. The Imperial General Staff contained men whose measure was momentum alone. They wanted to press while victory warmed their hands. The army, especially, argued from habit and doctrine. War of land, always land. An attack on the Soviet Union, a path Yamamoto briefly considered, was vetoed. The army's boots were already heavy with commitments in China and Southeast Asia. A northern campaign would be a different war than the Navy wished to fight, so the choices narrowed and sharpened like blades. Yamamoto proposed bold, almost theatrical options: sweep into the Indian Ocean, seize Ceylon, draw the British fleet out, and destroy it, as he had aimed to do to the Americans at Pearl Harbor, then push west into the Middle East to link up with Germany and secure oil. The army refused. Their ambitions did not stretch to deserts and camels. The Naval General Staff pushed for Australia, a long, slow annexation of territory across New Guinea, New Caledonia, Fiji and Samoa. They drew supply lines on papyrus and set occupation systems for lands that would be years of expense and resistance. Yamamoto rejected Australia. He judged it too long and too ordinary. He wanted a spectacle, a single, decisive demonstration that could force negotiation before the American industrial machine reset. He wanted to break the enemy's carrier force, not to scatter into a war of attrition. So he ordered plans for MI, a carrier battle at Midway, and the AL plan, a northern diversion into the Aleutians that might, he hoped, distract American focus. In January, he sent officers with those plans to Tokyo. He had chosen risk, but a contained surgical risk. He had not chosen endless stretching. The men who would carry these orders were not decision-makers. They were conscripts, labor battalions, naval pioneers who read their orders as if they were constellations. For them, strategy was boots, rice, and coral. They were the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, soon to be named in dispatches and later intercepted radio logs, units that would build runways and wharves on small, salt-swept islands. They hammered and dug and cursed mosquitoes into the night, unaware of the grand design inked on an admiral's map. When war was abstract, they were practical. When it grew sharp, they would be the wedge driven into human bodies. Yamamoto knew this. He kept pictures of men in his head, veterans, exhausted sailors, lads handed rifles instead of diplomas. His warning was not merely strategic, it was a moral plea. Win a decisive victory, then bargain. He feared the alternative, a long, grinding war that would consume men like the pioneers he had dispatched. But his words ran against a tide of pride. War fever is a contagious thing. It feeds on images of speed and success, and it ignores the slow math of industry, of oil, of replacement. Even before the ink dried on the MI and AL plans, there were signs the gamble would not be entirely in Japan's control. The carriers at sea during Pearl Harbor had survived. Their absence from the charts of the defeated did not mean they had vanished. The war, for all its initial splendor, carried a wild card, the enemy's capacity to change and to endure. Yamamoto had not expected Singapore to fall so quickly. He had not expected the globe to contract so neatly. And even as he planned, his enemies recalculated. He ordered what he thought would produce a bargaining table. The world was rearranging itself to deny bargaining, until more blood was spilled. This is where the loser's perspective widens. It is not only the final defeat, but the slow narrowing of choices that turns audacity into desperation. Yamamoto's caution was a hand on the throttle. The Hawk's insistence was a foot to the floor. The men who paid would not be the strategists. They would be the laborers who woke to be given picks for beaches they had never seen, the sailors who would be left at anchor because the admiral feared assassination, the officers whose letters home would describe only orders and not the calculus behind them. In the quiet moments aboard the Yamato, and in the smoky rooms of the Imperial General Staff, other voices tried to be heard. Motome Ugaki, his chief of staff, wrote in a diary that read like a warning to future readers. Far-sighted governance was now needed, he wrote, because the first month of victories demanded steadiness. Yamamoto's public criticism of politicians, of Prince Konoye and others who did not grasp what kind of war to fight, would make enemies. He spoke, too, of the need for political action when Singapore fell, thinking that Britain might then be open to negotiation. He knew the British temperament. He had negotiated in London and had watched the slow priorities of a sea empire. He knew the Americans, too, from his years as naval attaché in Washington. He read nations like people, their weak points, their strengths, the time it took them to muster. Yet even as Yamamoto paced charts and cautioned coalition, the machinery of expansion did not wait. Plans were drawn, flags raised, piers extended. For every map that showed a clean line to victory, there were men with calloused hands building runways where guns would later blast them into the air. For every policy speech that praised the empire, there were soldiers who read each new order as potential doom, but obeyed because obedience was the only clear thing left. The questions that rose from these rooms of command were not merely tactical, they were human questions. How long would courage last when the food dwindled and the rain would not stop? How many spirits could be drained by the slow heat of a jungle? How would a nation reconcile the grief of mothers at home with the exhilaration of parades? What happens when the man who warns of limits is outshouted or removed? Yamamoto believed in risk measured by reason. Others believed in the immortality of victory. He sent the MI and AL plans forward, not as triumphs, but as desperate attempts to close a window. He believed that if he could force a big enough, spectacular success, the diplomats might have something to bargain with. He feared privately that the moment for bargaining might pass, and that the empire would be left to fight on terms it could not win. On the shore in Tokyo, the fireworks still exploded that night. Under them, men and women toasted an empire that stretched like an octopus. On the Yamato, the admiral listened to the distant noise and felt something else, the future contracting, like a fist closing around the neck of possibility. He had ordered the plans. He had asked for time. He had not asked for the faces of the men who would be lost to fill his memory. What does a commander do when he foresees loss, but cannot stop the engines he helps run? Since his voice alone cannot bind the nation, he chooses the scales of risk. He bets on a big stroke, thinking that shock can be converted into diplomacy. He hopes, too, that those who will execute his orders, the pioneers on coral atolls, the sailors in the dark, will forgive the architects when the dust settles. History will not answer for them. It will only tell whether the gamble bought time or bought ruin. A month and a half later, when another shock arrives from an unexpected quarter, the terms of Yamamoto's wager will change. But those who must hold the islands, who will be assigned to build the airstrips and fire the guns, will know only this. The maps told a story, but the soil told another. They will learn that plans become peril when they meet wind and rain and teeth. They will learn that in war the losers are not always defined by defeat. Sometimes they are defined by the moment they first understand that victory was never meant for them. Will a single spectacle alter a nation's fate? Will the men who build an airfield become bargaining chips in a room full of generals? The answer will not be tidy. The next phase of this story moves south, to coral and fever, and to the noise of engines and distant aircraft. The question that haunts the admiral's maps now is simple and terrible. Who will pay for a gamble meant to save an empire? They thought the war was over when Singapore fell, but for many, it was only the next step toward a longer, more personal loss. On 15th of February 1942, the British surrender at Singapore was a headline that echoed around the world. In London, it was a shock. In Tokyo, it was expected triumph. On the ground, it was a rearrangement of human lives. For the Japanese planners, it should have been a strategic opening. The moment Yamamoto had imagined might soften British will. Instead, the fall of Singapore became another fact in a cascading set of events that pushed commanders to make choices faster and more violently. Pride met unpredictability. The men who had built runways, hauled supplies, and slept in tents found their labor assigned new meanings overnight. A sergeant who had learned to fix an engine on a tiny corroded strip of tarmac now found himself told to dig a drainage trench at dawn. The map had moved. His life had not. Then came the Doolittle Raid, a small American mission in April that hit Tokyo and other cities. You can imagine what it felt like for a nation used to daily acclamation, like seeing your home window smashed by a kid with a slingshot. It was a psychological blow that reverberated beyond the blast. In rooms where admirals and ministers argued about calendars, the raid became proof that distance did not mean safety, and that surprise could undo prestige. For soldiers and workers stationed in the distant south, the Doolittle mission was a signal that the war would not bend to speeches and parades. It would be noisy, uncertain, and personal. At the same time, Japan was expanding its forward line. Rabaul, a dark, volcanic harbor, became a hub. Ships and planes streamed to New Ireland and New Britain. Men were sent to build seaplane bases and coral strips, thinking tool and time would secure an empire. The 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces, ordinary units whose job was to make land fit for war, were dispatched to places with names most did not recognize before the conflict. They were like anyone at work today who is given a new urgent project with impossible deadlines. You learn to sleep less, to improvise, to patch one task while another breaks. They labored under heat and mosquitoes, under the constant hum of engines and the smell of diesel, and they were never told the full plan. They obeyed because it was a discipline that could be counted on when the world had no clear moral maps. Across the water, Australia felt its own version of panic. Messages slid across cables. MacArthur's pleas, Australian warnings that the Japanese were building a chain of bases to choke Australia off from help. Picture an office where the roof is leaking and the water is pooling under important documents. You start shoving things higher, calling in contractors, moving what you can. General MacArthur sent urgent cables for carriers and planes, the modern equivalents of calling the fire brigade. In Washington, the reply was a sober calculation. Admiral King explained that carriers and aircraft were limited, that the Pacific could not be flooded with resources overnight. He was right. When you care for a family on a tight budget, you learn to prioritize. Nations do the same, and their arithmetic is cold. This arithmetic shaped lives. Men who would be on the front lines were aware of the scarcity, in the same way a nurse knows when a hospital runs low on supplies. You change protocols, improvise, wonder if what you have will be enough. Admiral King's bluntness, we have only 2 carriers ready until the end of June, forced Allied planners to be pragmatic. They built a defensive line down the South Pacific. They trained amphibious units with new, clumsy equipment, as if assembling furniture from unpacked parts with no manual. The Amphibious Training Command worked to create techniques that had no real prior example, and men like Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner learned on the job how to load supplies so they could be used in order, how to land troops where the enemy might be waiting. These are small, human parallels. When you throw a party, you plan the food in order. If the guests arrive early or the oven breaks, you improvise. In war, the stakes of improvisation are not embarrassment. They are life and death. And improvisation breeds errors. Supplies were loaded without proper order in Auckland and sent to Noumea, which lacked facilities to resequence them. Imagine packing your car in the dark for a long road trip, and at the first stop, realizing everything you need is at the bottom of a crate. That is the battlefield logistics that turned victory into vulnerability. People argue about command, as lovers argue about money. Tempers flare, responsibilities blur, and someone must take the final decision. MacArthur wanted amphibious operations under Army control. Admiral King distrusted giving naval assets to Army command. Fletcher, having lost carriers at Coral Sea and Midway, was cautious. He promised only 2 days of carrier cover. That promise was a line of code that would soon shape lives ashore. Turner and Gormley, tasked with coordinating the southern defenses, argued and planned and made compromises. They trained troops that had never executed an operation like this since the Spanish-American War. Imagine being asked to perform a ballet after 3 rehearsals. Men moved forward anyway because the alternative, letting the enemy get an unopposed foothold, seemed worse. The Japanese, for their part, did not expect an invasion at Guadalcanal. After months of swift victories, it was hard to imagine the Allies organizing a seaborne assault. The construction troops on Guadalcanal slept in tents and ate porridge in the morning, not knowing the day would soon become a battlefield. When American intelligence intercepted a radio about the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces heading to a place called Lunga, the dots began to connect. That intercept was like seeing a message on your phone about a delivery that reveals a much larger plan, subtle, small, consequential. As the Allies moved, their reconnaissance had gaps. PBY's B-17s and Coast Watchers produced fragments, useful but not complete. The most obvious approach for a Japanese fleet to reach Guadalcanal, a sea lane that sailors would call the slot, went relatively unsearched at crucial times. The military messages that should have coordinated those search patterns fell through bureaucratic cracks. It is like a group chat, where an important message is never read. The result is misaligned action and surprise. Men queued for landing craft unaware that a night strike might be steaming toward them. Men who loaded supplies on beaches did not know that their buffer, carrier air cover, had a time limit. There is also the human psychology of overconfidence. Victory breeds habits of assuming the enemy will not surprise you. The Japanese believed their air power dominance at Rabaul would be enough to control the surroundings. American planners believed that the carriers they risked could deter a major Japanese surface action. Both sides were balancing hope against fear, like someone deciding to drive in a storm or wait it out. Hope can be rational. It can also be an act of denial. For the people on the ground, this strategic chess was mostly noise until the first explosions. In barracks and tents, soldiers adjusted daily routines, mending uniforms, oiling rifles, trading cigarettes. The long-term cost of strategy appears suddenly in the short-term details. A missing bolt means a stalled truck. A late ration means hunger at dawn. Families at home watched newsreels and felt pride, fear, and a daily grind of worry. It is the same emotional architecture you see now in tough times. When businesses lay off co-workers, when a family faces illness, people juggle panic with small acts of care that keep life moving. This part of the story is a lesson in how high strategy meets ordinary lives and turns them into decisions with consequences. It is a lesson in proximity. Decisions far away change the tomorrow of a man who wakes with mosquito bites and a shovel in his hand. It is also a lesson in timing. The Doolittle Raid, small in military terms, rewired the confidence in Tokyo and pushed the Japanese to react differently than they might have. A little noise can refocus a whole policy. If you feel the weight of these choices, you will see why it matters to follow every detail that comes next. Every logistic error, every misread radio, every hurried rehearsal becomes a small hinge on which lives turn. If you want to understand how those hinges worked, how ordinary men were folded into decisions of statesmen, and how loss sometimes begins in a drawing room as much as in a foxhole, keep watching. Click the red button in the corner now to subscribe. Stay with us through the rest of this series, where we trace these choices from rooms of command to the mud and fire where people paid the price. Join us so you will not miss the next episode. The moment when the first landing met an island, the Empire thought secure, and lives changed in a day. They had the radio intercept and they had a date, but understanding it was another thing. In July, an intercepted Japanese message named the 11th and 13th Pioneer Forces and said they would arrive on July 4th. At Pearl Harbor, the radio room put two and two together. For some officers, that was the bright flash of clarity. An airfield was being built on Guadalcanal. For others, it was a blurred sentence on a busy day. Admiral Turner, passing through Pearl, paused long enough to read the note and feel the weight of an assignment that would not forgive delay. He was told to train an amphibious task force in a month. Imagine being asked to organize a complex move, landing troops, unloading supplies, setting up a beachhead, with 1 month and no clear playbook. That was the reality. Men who would be responsible for thousands of lives had to make plans on little sleep, with scarce equipment, and under an invisible deadline. Their stress was the kind you know when a family emergency forces you to rearrange everything in a day. The difference was that in war, lives hang on the success of the improvisation. The rehearsals were meant to cure fear, but instead they exposed it. At Koro Island, the practice landing lasted 3 days and ended with only a third of the troops making it ashore. Men who had trained at camp were confused when faced with surf, unfamiliar boats, and the pressure to move fast. A colonel later wrote that the practice was a complete bust. General Vandergrift watched his men struggle and felt the same sinking worry a coach feels when a team cannot execute the simplest play. Yet orders were orders. Thousands of Marines from California, Pearl Harbor, Noumea, and Samoa were already on the move. The timetable would not bend for rehearsal failures. Planning meetings grew hot. Arguments about authority and risk hardened into promises that would shape what happened on the beaches. Admirals and generals argued the way people argue about money, sharply and with long memories. MacArthur wanted army control for the amphibious mission. King and his naval advisors worried about losing sea assets under army command. Fletcher had lost carriers at Coral Sea and Yorktown. He was cautious by nature and by sorrow. He told everyone the carriers could only be exposed for 2 days. For men ashore, that was a small, brittle promise. 2 days of air cover, then nothing. Admiral Turner accepted the plan with a soldier's obedience, but inside he counted risks like a man who checks the locks at night. Logistical errors multiplied the danger. Ships were sent to Noumea, which lacked the docks and facilities of Auckland, so supplies were unloaded in confusion. Imagine packing for a long move, shipping everything to the wrong depot, and then trying to find a single box amid 100 crates, only on a beach, under possible enemy fire. Why did this coordination fail when the stakes were so high? The answer was human and ordinary. Too many commands, too many assumptions, and not enough time. Men who had to talk together belonged to different services with different rules. Messages about search patterns and supply priorities were lost in the shuffle. The naval air forces, MacArthur's Army Air Forces, and the Coast Watchers all had pieces of the picture, but no one had the whole. It looks like a small communication failure on paper, yet it was the kind of error that makes people later ask the unbearable question, could it have been avoided? Who watches the watchers when the clock is counting down? Admiral Gormley arrived with doubts. He had been sent to form the South Pacific Force and take command on June 19th, but by the time he reached Pearl Harbor, the enemy had already begun to move. He carried with him a heavy sense that the United States was not ready for an aggressive amphibious campaign in the Solomons. He tried to get Seabees and essential construction units sent quickly to New Zealand, but the flow of resources was slow. He met MacArthur in Melbourne and felt the same misgiving. MacArthur did not like the plan and feared that his forces would be subordinated to naval command. They wired Washington and suggested a delay. The answer came back, no. King had seen the larger picture and refused to allow delay. He had ordered a defensive line to protect Australia and believed an immediate action in the South Pacific would be cheaper in lives than letting the Japanese build an unassailable base. So Gormley left Melbourne convinced the operation was premature, but determined to make it work. Think about times you must do something you consider unwise because your boss said so. That feeling, doubt wrapped in duty, settled on many commanders like a damp cloak. Turner's task was practical and cruel. He had to move ships, arrange landing craft, organize supply sequencing, and train embarkation crews in a single month. The flagship, the Macaulay, a converted passenger ship, became the center of a frantic logistical ballet. Men loaded ammunition, crates of food, fuel drums, vehicles, often without order. Auckland had docks and could have sorted the supplies, but the convoy was diverted to Noumea. There, the lack of space and equipment meant that supplies were heaped randomly on transports. The result? At the beach, the men found piles of supplies they could not process quickly. When the carriers left as scheduled, supplies were still jammed on the shore. Imagine trying to build a house, but the bricks are dumped in an open field with no blueprint. The Marines found themselves surrounded by the very things meant to help them, yet in no organized way to use them. The psychology of those on deck and ashore mixed adrenaline with small grinding fears. Would the boats arrive on time? Would the pilots be there to stop enemy attacks? Would the enemy even be there at all? The Japanese intelligence picture was imperfect too. They were surprised by the invasion, having been focused on New Guinea. In some ways, both sides were groping toward the same truth. The ocean between them was not an empty space, but a volume of hazards. Sea lanes like the channel between Guadalcanal and Savo, later called the Slot, were obvious approaches, yet they lay unguarded at critical times because no one had the resources to watch everything. The consequences of that gap were moral as well as tactical. Officers lay awake wondering whether their choices would place young men into avoidable danger. What do you do when the map shows danger, but the clock forces action? The human cost of rushed planning shows in the smallest details. Men who would later be called heroes were at first only tired soldiers trying to do their job. They practiced landings for days and felt their confidence go brittle. They learned that in a true landing, discipline and improvisation must live together. On the logistics side, sailors and stevedores worked to unload ships in the dark, braving fuel spills and the threat of air attack. Supply officers made lists and crossed things out as the situation changed. The men who wrote those lists were ordinary. Clerks, petty officers, NCOs who knew the exact weight of an ammunition crate and the number of lives it might save. They were not architects of grand strategy, but their work would determine its success. There was also a quiet moral conflict among commanders. Fletcher's insistence on short carrier exposure came from a place of trauma. He had seen carrier decks burn and go down. King's insistence on rapid action came from a strategic calculus that put Australia and the line of communication first. MacArthur's desire for control came from a hunger to reclaim honor after the retreat from the Philippines. Each man's past shaped his decision. Their personalities were not abstract. They were parts of a national psychology of fear, pride, and the will to act. Those human factors are the hidden currents that move wars as much as guns and ships. What if the leaders are also prisoners of their own memories? As the convoy gathered, men packed in troopships and moved quietly across dark seas. They did not know that many factors were stacked against them: incomplete reconnaissance, misrouted supplies, divided command, and carriers that would not stay long. They had faith in training, in their officers, and in the promise that the plan would work. That faith is like the trust you place in a car mechanic. You cannot see the engine, but you expect it to hold. In war, that trust can hold and it can break. In this case, confidence and cracks existed side by side. The choice to go ahead was made in public with firm voices. In private, many officers felt the cold intelligence of risk. When the fleet sailed, it took with it hopes and doubts. The men were mostly young and had never fought in an amphibious invasion. Their training might be enough, it might not. The Japanese, busy elsewhere, were not ready for an invasion on Guadalcanal. That would give the Allies a moment of surprise and opportunity. But the blind lane down the slot and the fragile logistics made the operation vulnerable to a night attack or to shortages if battle lasted longer than planned. The fragility of the plan was human in its source: miscommunication, lack of time, and the exhaustion of resources. War often turns on such ordinary failures. Will the gamble pay off when men and machines meet in the surf? The next chapter will take us to the day the landing craft hit the water, and to the islands where unfinished breakfast tables sat beside sandbagged gun emplacements. It will show how surprise, courage, and disaster braided together in shapes no one in a planning room could fully predict. Keep watching to see how the small errors and the big decisions collide on a single shore, and how those who built the runways, loaded the crates, and stood watch would live or die by the choices made in rooms far from the surf. They came in the grey cold of morning, like a hand reaching for a table already set. On August 7, 1942, the sky cleared over the Solomons and the American carriers sent their planes out with surgical intent. The initial strikes were textbook surprise. Wasp, Saratoga, and Enterprise loosed their fighters and dive bombers against seaplanes at Gavutu, the radio station at Tulagi, and scattered small craft. The Japanese seaplane base was a cluster of boats and hangars on 2 islets. By midday, 9 floatplanes and 8 seaplanes lay broken in the water or smouldering on the shore. The flying boats, lumbering Kawanishis, were gone. For the crews who had tended them, the morning was a sudden theft of future flight and a ruin of routine. Men who had mopped oil from decks and counted propeller bolts saw their machines rust into wreckage in hours. That sight is the small cruelty of war. Labor erased in an instant. Across the channel, Marines stepped from landing craft into a world that was at once domestic and alien. On Guadalcanal, they found breakfast plates still half full on a small table in a tent. Bowls of rice stood with chopsticks abandoned, like hastily dropped pens. The scene was uncanny, an intimate life interrupted. On Tulagi and on the tiny Gavutu and Tanambogo islets, the picture was the opposite. The Japanese soldiers there, many seasoned airbase personnel and combat veterans, had prepared pockets of iron resistance. In wood and stone embrasures, the defenders waited with machine guns and a doctrine that made surrender almost unthinkable. The first collision, then, was a clash of ordinary routines, American surprise, and the Japanese decision to fight utterly. The fighting on those small islands was brutal in scale and intimate in cruelty. On Tulagi, a raider unit under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson met dugouts and caves and found snipers tied up in trees, making the jungle a web of unseen death. Edson's raiders were volunteers and hardened. They had trained for long-range commando work and expected speed. Instead, they learned the old grinding math of frontal assault: dynamite downholes, grenades thrown like petitions, men shoved into choke points where each step forward cost bones and blood. By the second day, the island was under American control, but the toll was high and the landscape smelled of smoke and rot. The official numbers: 200 Japanese killed, 3 surrendered, many dozens of American wounded and some killed, are statistics that flatten the particular human tragedies written on faces and in letters home. Gavutu and Tanambogo were worse. The Japanese had fortified the small volcanic rises and dug into the stone. When the first waves of Marines hit the beach, they met with rifle and machine gun fire before craft could even settle. Reinforcements came and were hampered by confusion. One preparatory shell hit a fuel dump and turned the landing into a nightmare under a bright, hostile glare. Tanks, a new kind of light land power at sea, were brought ashore but were sometimes neutralized by simple means. Crowbars jammed under treads, gasoline and fire, men who would rush a machine even knowing the chance of success was thin. In one case, a tank crew killed scores of attackers before a Japanese soldier climbed the engine deck and killed the commander with a bayonet. By the time the last dugout was blown, the 500-strong Japanese garrison had been annihilated to the last man. The Americans suffered around 250 casualties on those islets. The vividness of those numbers is smaller than the memory of a man who crawled into a cave and found 35 bodies. Some had died days earlier, some in the last instant. These images would be carved into survivors' minds for life. What happened in the air that day was another kind of savage learning. Japanese planners had not expected the United States to launch a seaborne invasion. Pilots flying out of Rabaul scanned for Australian convoys and for American remnants. They found instead modern carrier aircraft operating close to shore. The Japanese bombers that took off to respond, 24 Mitsubishi Bettys escorted by 18 Zeros, were on a 1,100-mile round trip from Rabaul. That distance matters. Range turns pilots from single-minded attackers into men who must conserve fuel and accept risk. The Bettys were armed for New Guinea. They carried bombs, not torpedoes. The Americans found and shot many of them down. Of the 24 Bettys that finally reached the area, all but one were destroyed in the initial engagement. That imbalance, a near-total loss of heavy bombers on a single mission, was a sharp cost for Tokyo. But the story of the air war that morning is not one-sided. The Zeros still held a quality American fighters could not match in turning and climb. The F-4F Wildcats were robust and armored, but slower and less agile. That mismatch forced tactical evolution. Pilots like Lieutenant V.P. Dupuy and Lieutenant G.E. Fireball learned quickly to avoid head-to-head dogfights with Zeros. They used pairs, scissors maneuvers, and concentrated fire to blunt the Japanese edge. By evening, losses were heavy on both sides. 6 American carrier pilots shot down that day, and several Wildcats badly damaged. The Enterprise's air group counted its dead and noted hard lessons. A flimsy, nimble plane with little armor will kill you by taunting you into a turn. The Wildcat's salvation lay in its ability to take punishment and in disciplined tactics. Later, tactics like the thatch weave formalized these improvisations. Here they began as instinct. When a third party watches these sketches in modern life, it is easy to forget that pilots and gunners are people who learned the art of survival through trial. Imagine being in a car with a failing brake system and trying to learn how to stop without a mechanic. Pilots improvising tactics in the air have a similar brittle ingenuity. Their choices are immediate and costly. At sea, the day's drama continued beyond aircraft losses. A Japanese reinforcement convoy had been sighted and then recalled after a submarine sank one transport, the Myomaru, with 342 men aboard. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the 8th Fleet, judged the reinforcement attempt too dangerous. He was not a man to throw lives where he saw only danger, yet Mikawa could fight with the ships he had. He gathered 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and a destroyer, and steamed them down toward Guadalcanal. His plan? Arrive after midnight, exploit the American weakness at night and make a decisive surface action against the unprotected transports and escorts. The Japanese had trained for night fighting. Their doctrine emphasized torpedoes, surprise, and close action. A night attack would deny Allied air power its day advantage and place the Americans into a realm of darkness where Japanese surface ships had excelled. The Americans had a blind spot, a gap of human and technical failure that would cost lives. Assigned search patterns by land-based PBYs, B-17s and coast watchers left the most obvious naval approach. The slot, the channel straight down past Santa Isabel, New Georgia, and between Florida Island and Guadalcanal, insufficiently watched. Search orders were fragmented across commands, and a message requesting special coverage through the slot went missing between headquarters. The fault was not one heroic mistake, but many small bureaucratic failures. Assumptions about what others were doing, a lost note, a delayed dispatch. In simple terms, the ocean lane remained as uncovered as a hallway with its lights switched off. By dusk, the tactical picture had shifted but not settled. The Americans held the beachheads and had seized a small strategic plain that would become Henderson Field. 11,000 Marines were ashore, and piles of supplies crowded the beaches. But those supplies were often disordered and hard to bring forward. The carriers had lost planes, and Fletcher, the carrier commander who had lost Lexington and Yorktown previously, wanted to protect what remained. He had ordered a strict limit. Carrier support for the invasion would last 2 days, and then they would withdraw. At 18 west on August 8th, Fletcher executed his plan and the carriers steamed away. Turner, the amphibious commander, suddenly faced the unpleasant arithmetic of a shore force with dwindling air cover and Japanese ships on the move. What did that withdrawal feel like to men ashore? It is like when the generators fail at a hospital. Lights flicker, monitors become unreliable, and the room fills with a hum of panic. The Marines had to reconfigure their security calculations. Where once they could assume a protective umbrella of carrier air, now they had to accept the reality of limited local air resources and the prospect of a night attack. The psychological strain of such a shift cannot be measured only by numbers. Men folded their faces into hands. Others tightened belts and checked guns. The weight of being momentarily uncovered pressed on everyone. Mikawa's fleet moved with dark purpose. Cruisers are less glamorous than carriers, but in a night fight, they are instruments of concentrated violence. Heavy guns, trained torpedomen, and crews who knew how to close silently. At St. George's Channel, the Japanese joined and slipped south. They hoped for surprise and planned to make it count against ships that had no air cover and crews who had not yet learned the lethal geometry of night naval combat in the Pacific. It was a gamble, but so were all gambles that night. The Americans had gambled that carriers could leave. The Japanese had gambled that take and strike could be coordinated across island clusters. The men on both sides trusted the competence of their crews and the strength of their doctrine. There is a final bitter human detail in this morning and evening of August 7th at 8. The way commands framed victory, even when the cost was raw. In Tokyo, early reports did not always register the depth of losses in planes. After Midway, the Japanese would suppress the truth about carrier losses for months. Here, at Guadalcanal, both sides tried to shape the narrative. The Marines with their bloodied uniforms wanted simple truths. Hold the ground, keep the airfield. Their letters home, when they were able to write, would oscillate between calm and horror. The Japanese men who died on the islets would mostly become names on lists, sometimes without graves that could be tended by families. This is part of the loser's perspective. War is a cascade that runs through bureaucracies and clerks and ends in small tragedies that official history often elevates into neat lines on a map. What comes next is darker. A night approaches that will test doctrine, assembly, and nerve. The cruisers slip through the slot toward a fleet that believes itself safe or merely exposed. The men ashore will learn how fragile a protective promise can be. The pilots in the carriers will learn how quickly the balance of power tilts when machines and men are matched by surprise and skill. The next hours will answer whether the Americans can hold a newly captured airfield, whether the Japanese can punish an exposed anchor, and whether the fog of war will swallow whole fleets or spare them. A world statistic to pull perspective. By mid-1942, the Pacific theater had become one segment of a global war in which more than 60 million soldiers and civilians would be mobilized across continents by the time it ended. The Guadalcanal struggle was a single narrow lane in that vast human torrent, but it would influence the larger flow. Control of the Solomons meant security for Australia, control of sea lanes, and the ability to project air power. For Tokyo, losing such a base meant a step toward erosion. For Washington and its allies, keeping it meant buying time, space, and a forward base for future offensives. The men who sailed, who flew, and who stormed those beaches deserved a simple accounting. They fought and some survived and some did not. Their lives, not the abstract balances of strategy, would become the ledger of this day. The Japanese pilots who made the 100-mile runs to attack knew they were exhausting fate and fuel. The American pilot who shot a Betty over Santa Isabel thought only of returning to his carrier. The raider who charged up a ridge with dynamite in hand thought only of the dugout before him. Decisions in Tokyo and Washington had their echoes here, but the last measure of the day was mercy and damage in the sand, in caves, and in the fuel-streaked water. As midnight drew a black line across the map, guns were primed, lookouts strained, and the sea itself seemed to hold its breath. Who would find whom in the night, and who would awake to count the dead? The sea that night held no judgment, only weight. Men on both sides watched the same black water and imagined different ends. For some, it was the promise of glory. For others, it was the practice of endurance. For all of them, it was a test of what a nation can ask of its people and what those people can bear. As command rooms in Tokyo and Washington argued over maps and timetables, it was men in the surf, in tents, in engine rooms, and on tiny islets who would live the consequences. Think of the young pioneer who cleared a strip of coral under a tropical sun. He was not a politician. He did not write strategy papers. He knew how to dig a drain, set a shim under a plank, and sleep where he could. Under Yamamoto's plans, his work mattered. It was practical and invisible, until it was not. When war turns logistics into targets, the humble laborer becomes a node in a deadly geometry. The man who slept beside the freshly laid runway, later awake to the thunder of bombs, would be the one to measure whether grand strategy had been worth his sweat. This is the loser's perspective, not the final tally of ships and planes, but the way human lives are parceled out to serve ideas. War is not only fought in fleets and in air wings. It is fought in the slow, small acts that make operations possible. Supply clerks who mislabel crates, signalmen who delay a message, captains who decide to withdraw carriers for fear of greater loss. Each choice ripples. None of these choices are innocent. They are moral acts, and they accrue burdens. We must imagine, too, the families who received those burdens. A mother in a Tokyo apartment watched newsreels and cheered, then learned weeks later that her son's unit was listed missing. A wife in San Diego kissed a photograph of a husband assigned to a carrier and read about planes lost in battle. Across nations, ordinary people held hope and dread in the same hands. The cost of decisions made in distant rooms was paid in kitchens and on porches and in quiet graves. History can make winners of many and losers of too many others. But the word loser can hide the truth that most people were neither architects of policy nor captains of fleets. They were workers, clerks, sailors, pilots, cooks, and children, the small engines of nations. When we say a nation lost or a battle was won, we must remember those who simply could not choose. Their private losses are often the largest. Strategically, Guadalcanal and the Solomons were not symbolic only. Control of that chain meant blocking a path to Australia and denying the enemy the capacity to project air power across wide ocean spaces. For Tokyo, every base gained tightened lines of supply and possibility. For the Allies, holding ground bought time to build a larger force and to protect sea lanes. But the map is a map. It does not feel the salt in a man's wound, the fever in a tent, or the silence after a comrade never returns to roll call. The calculus of empires reduces people to points on a chart. We must not permit that reduction in our minds. I want you to imagine a scene. A lieutenant in a small foxhole, rain in his face, a mess tin pressed to his knees. He writes a letter by matchlight because pens run out and the radio is useless. He writes to a mother who keeps a photograph in an album. He does not tell her about the radio intercepts or the arguments between admirals. He tells her about the day's sun and the smell of diesel. This letter is ordinary. It will become extraordinary when she reads it and finds the handwriting smudged with the salt of grief. These ordinary acts, letters, small kindnesses, moments of fear, are the human ledger of the campaign. We must also recognize the moral ambiguity of many who acted. Some officers, like Yamamoto, warned privately, and later felt responsible for the consequences of choices he had helped enable. He was not a simple villain or a simple hero. He was a man who saw limits and tried, late and imperfectly, to impose them. Others, hardened by doctrine or hubris, pressed for wider conquests. Their choices carried conviction, but also blind spots. Across the whole conflict, many believed a single victory could fix what politics had fractured. That belief is powerful and dangerous. It seduces with the promise of a clean end to complexity. History rarely provides such ends. Reflection is not merely an exercise in pity. It is an act of moral learning. If we study how decisions born of pride and haste became orders that men could not refuse, we learn to ask hard questions today. What burdens do we ask of those who cannot speak for themselves? How do we weigh a political aim against the real lives required to pursue it? When we celebrate strategy, do we also account for the small daily sacrifices that win or lose it? You might think these questions are far from your life. They are not. Every time an organization makes a fast decision that affects others, a company laying off workers, a government cutting services, a school closing classrooms. Choices ripple through households with the same quiet severity. The lesson here is practical. Speed without care is a form of cruelty. Care without action is often ruinous. The balance is the hard task of responsible leadership. We must also remember the survivors who carried sorrow and the quiet dignity of ordinary people who rebuilt their lives. After the guns fell silent in many places, communities gathered the dead, wrote names on stones, and tried to make sense in small rituals. These acts were not small because they were private. They were the most human response to an inhuman situation. Memorials and graves do not repay a life, but they assert that a life was more than a point on a strategy map. When we look at history, nostalgia for simple narratives is a temptation. The truth is messier. People acted from mixed motives: patriotism, fear, ambition, duty. The losers in any conflict are not only the defeated state, they are the ones whose choices did not matter in the end, whose quiet work was the foundation of battles they did not direct. To honor them, we must do more than remember names. We must let their stories teach us how to think and act. If this account has moved you, there is more to learn and to reflect upon. Subscribe to this channel to follow the rest of the series, where we trace the human consequences of high decisions in other campaigns of the war. Like the video if you believe remembering the small human costs of history is important. Leave a comment with your questions, or share a memory or family story. You may keep names anonymous if you prefer. Your voice helps keep this history alive, not as dry dates, but as lived experience. In understanding the loser's perspective, we honor the dignity of those who had the least power to decide their fate and the greatest cost to bear.